Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends, as you know, Last year, the UN Secretary General called for a food systems summit to unleash the power of food to drive progress across all 17 United Nations development goals. I thank you for stepping forward to become a leader for the food systems change. These dialogues bring together people from all parts of society to share evidence, experience, and new ideas. Food is powerful. The food we eat brings us together as families, as communities, and as nations. It underpins our culture, our economies, and our relationship with the natural world. The world's food system touches every aspect of human existence, which makes them valuable instruments of change. The reason we are having a summit this year, and the reason we are here today, is because we are off track. We are not set to achieve on our shared vision and goals for the 2030 agenda. Our food systems have staggering levels of inequality. Our key priority for this summit is to bring more inclusive, equitable, and healthier food systems while also safeguarding our planet. These dialogues are a core element of the summit process. They are an opportunity to come together and identify priorities and actions to be taken for a better future. This will be a people's summit, but it will also be a solution summit. Because everyone is part of the food system, we are looking to get all of you and your ideas around the table to ensure that action is owned and driven by different actors. We want action to be driven by you. Your leadership and ability to have courageous conversations rather than avoid them will be very critical. If we can't have courageous conversations about what needs to change and how we need to work together, then we won't be able to go very far. We need each of you to determine the food system you want for your future and to act on it to make them a reality. We must do this understanding fully well our place in the world and that what we do as individuals impacts on others. I look forward to working with you in this summit process. Together, we can build a world of inclusive growth, environmental sustainability, and social justice. We can build a resilient world where no one is hungry, no one is poor, and no one is left behind. I thank you.
Hello again, I'm Anya Lawler and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's dialogue, the third in a series of 4 national dialogues that will all be feeding into that United Nations Food Systems Summit in the autumn. Our first 2 dialogues, which are both, by the way, available to watch back on the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine's YouTube channel, they discussed Ireland's 2030 agri-food strategy. Last week, the theme was health and well-being, not just in more nutritious and more sustainable food production, but also in sustaining the communities that produce that food. So this afternoon, our focus is going to be on change through the innovation of science and technology and how that will change the foods we eat and the way we produce them, and also by listening to the voices of young people, the food producers and consumers of the future who are demanding and driving change in our food systems. And once again, we have 2 great panels for our discussions, a brilliant keynote speaker in Dr Colin Sage, and in a moment I'll hand you over to the chairperson of this afternoon's dialogue. She's Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr Paula Walsh. The key point is we want to hear from you, so please send us your questions and comments and reactions, and we'll be feeding those into our dialogues with our panels. We're using Slido today, so please join in the conversation online. Simply take out your smartphone and open your browser, go to slido.com, enter our event code, which is #foodsystems. You can now ask questions and vote for the ones you like. And we've started with the following question, which will be one of the questions we'll put to our first panel. So how would you describe the connection between the rural agri-food producing community and urban consumers? And that's going to be a big theme of that conversation. We want to know what you think. Is it excellent? Most Irish people have a strong connection to our agricultural tradition. Do you think it's good but it's declining, or good and it's getting stronger? Do you think it's poor that urban consumers have no appreciation of agri-food production? So we want to hear from you. As I say, we'll be feeding your results into that panel discussion. And for more information on Ireland's food system and the UN Food Systems Summit this year, visit gov.ie/food systems, where you can also register for our forthcoming and final dialogue. The public consultation on the environmental assessment of the draft Agri-Food Strategy 2030 is now open until June the 15th. Go to gov.ie/consultations to have your say. We look forward to hearing from you. And let's get today's dialogue underway now. And to do that, I'm going to hand you over to our chairperson this afternoon, the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, member of the Food Safety Consultative Council of the Food Safety Authority. Please welcome Dr Paula Walsh.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you today to the third Irish National Dialogue, Promoting an Inclusive Food System for the Future. My name is Paula Walsh, and I'm the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, and I'm involved in the One Health approach for animal health, public health, food safety and food authenticity. I wish to thank the conveners today for asking me to be your chair. As those of you who have attended previous dialogues will know, these dialogues are part of a continuum of Ireland's engagement with the UN Food Systems Summit in September this year. The UN seek to revitalise and invigorate the aim to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN by awakening the world to the challenges facing us across our current framework of production, processing and consumption of food. Our understanding of what a sustainable food system would look like has grown over the last two dialogues. We recognise the complexities, the contradictions, and indeed even the apprehension that the discussion engenders. The need for transformation has been stated. The fact that there is a burning bush and no time to lose is acknowledged. We face a critical time and our actions will impact future generations. However, the ongoing crisis of COVID-19 as well as Brexit serve as illustrations of determination and resilience that may hearten us as we face these challenges. It is agreed that a sustainable food system has to consider vital components across the economic, social and environmental aspects. Under the model, producers must flourish, people must be nourished, and the environment must be revitalised. I have no doubt that today's dialogue will prove to be a positive addition to the overall discussion on food systems, ultimately provoking the necessary conversations that will allow progress on the goals. Parallel to the UN food system dialogues here in Ireland, we have our own consultation on our draft agri-food strategy for 2030. This agri-food strategy sets out Ireland's vision for how we will become a world leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade, through a shared collaboration across all sectors of society, all strata of the agri-sector, and of course, including the consumer. This ambition is challenging, and today we are here to examine how Ireland can progress its journey, and in particular how we can achieve an inclusive model across the generations as well as across the urban-rural divide. In addition, we will explore the importance of research and innovation and how it will act as a driver to the necessary transformation of our sustainability model. To open today's event, I have the pleasure of welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr Colin Sage, who worked with UCC and is now an independent scholar based in Portugal. He has long experience in food systems with a particular interest in social justice and environmental and food policy. And I will look forward to his views on how current policy has impacted our society and our planet. He has keen interest in how policy can lead to transformation and social change, and we look forward to his learnings on that front. Our first panel will address the influence of young people in shaping the future of sustainable food systems. The necessary transformation cannot happen without the voice of our youth, as they are the ones who will be most negatively impacted if we fail in our commitments. We hear frequently of how we are losing our ecosystems, but for some of our youths, they feel that they may never have time to experience the ecosystems which many of us have enjoyed during our lifetime. If we think there is a burning bush, it is they who will feel the flames. The panel will also address the oft-referenced urban-rural divide, the lost connection between urban populations and their food, Does it matter? If so, how does it matter? This also appears to have generational context, with younger people no longer being exposed to farming ways, but needing education to understand from where their food comes. We will hear of the challenges that presents, and I hope, ideas on ways to move forward. Our second panel will be discussing research and innovation, the pathway from thought to research, from research to findings, from findings to application, to policy, and then policy to transformation. However, it is not as simple as it sounds. But the knowledge gleaned by research will play an indispensable role in constructing the toolkits for the production models of the future. Collaboration and inclusion mechanisms across government, private investment, state bodies, farmers, processors, and other actors will need to be clarified and maximised for social benefits. It has been said before, but I will repeat it, consensus is not the aim at these dialogues. Open and honest questions and views are needed, with all perspectives on the table. I would encourage you all today to send questions to your moderator and to contribute to answer the Slido questions. Without further ado, I will now ask Dr. Colin Sage to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barry Walsh, for that warm introduction. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the department's willingness to address the matter of inclusion as part of this dialogues process. It's a topic that often may fall off the agenda when compared to, say, the imperative of economic growth when we're thinking about our food system. So I'm going to begin by giving some context about why inclusion is so vital. And I have to say, I'm likely to do this in a provocative and controversial kind of a way, because these are questions, as Dr. Barry Walsh said, we're not looking for consensus, we're looking to maintain and develop a conversation around some of these issues. And so thinking about a food system for the future surely has to be not only inclusive, but a more sustainable and healthier one. So taking as my point of departure, I want to just make reference to the draft agri strategy for 2030. We might first of all reflect on the state of food security and nutrition in Ireland. Even before the current pandemic struck, 1 in 8 Irish households were regarded as suffering from food poverty. The circumstances of economic austerity and increasingly precarious employment faced by many lower income households, in particular since the financial crash of 2010, resulted in increasing numbers presenting at food banks. Now, this is not a distinctly Irish problem. In 2018, around 800,000 tonnes of food products were distributed to nearly 10 million people via charitable organisations across Europe. And of course, the pandemic has significantly exacerbated this problem. As families try to get by on PUP payments, that is, they qualify. So the issue of food redistribution through charitable organisations may at first glance appear to be a win-win to redirect surplus food from landfill to feeding hungry people. But in my view, it does not demonstrate a societal commitment to the human right to food. And it certainly doesn't deliver food security with dignity. So these are the foundational principles around which to build a more inclusive food system. Indeed, for many, it's been described as the use of leftover food for left behind people, and other social policy analysts have argued that the charitable food distribution model has become part of the problem of food insecurity as opposed to part of the solution. Above all, I suppose, this issue of surplus food demonstrates the structural nature of industrial food systems that are characterized by mass manufacturing of highly processed foods, leading to huge surpluses, which we could arguably say are then dumped on the so-called needy. We learned from last week's dialogue that we also have in Ireland one of the highest rates of overweight and obesity in Europe. And this is not, again, a question of irresponsibility on the part of consumers, but the logical outcome of a food system delivering unhealthy diets, again, particularly to those on low incomes. Around 70% of mortality is linked to non-communicable diseases, most of which are diet-related. In the EU, NCDs are thought to cost around €700 billion annually to member states of the European Union. We might also note that senior health professionals in the NHS last year submitted a document to the UK government highlighting the pressure that the NHS was under as a consequence of diet-related chronic diseases. Their statement argued for serious policy measures to regulate junk food and to encourage more plant-based food consumption. If we know what constitutes a healthy diet, it's worth reminding ourselves that barely 1% of the Irish population eats in line with the food pyramid, and not, I don't think, not even 40% of their population are getting their 5 a day. And this is because the food environment in which we live is one which promotes energy-dense, micronutrient-poor foods and beverages. Products which are high in saturated fats, sugar and salt are tasty, cheap and ubiquitous, and responsible for a public health crisis. Yet, in spite of this knowledge, we continue to focus on pulling out drowning people from the river, some of whom, of course, as we heard last week, become the patients of Dr. Donald O'Shea, without ever asking why people are falling in upstream. We must begin to ask questions of the obesogenic food environment in our towns and cities that encourages people to eat badly, if cheaply, if we want to build a healthier food system for the future. Now, to speak of a food system is, of course, to broaden this perspective beyond agriculture, and it is to recognise the interconnected concerns of health, of well-being, but also the diverse cultural meanings that food has, the skills, knowledge and self-esteem that it can promote, and its role in strengthening community. And this was a point made last week by Brenda Dunford and Kathleen, who spoke very well on this topic. Food then is arguably a wellspring of so much more than economic exchange. And it is many of these diverse attributes beyond the economic that might provide the means for inclusion. Before we look at some of the methods that might bring people more into the food system, I want to briefly turn my attention to the term sustainability, which features strongly in the 2030 strategy and is widely used by the industry to promote its green credentials. I have to say that when I see the term sustainability applied so frequently across the sector, I have to think of Harry Potter. Harry, as many of you know, had an invisibility cloak that allowed him to move through the corridors of Hogwarts without being spotted by Professor Snape. I think sustainability is often deployed in much the same way, as a cloak to conceal the hard evidence that industrial agriculture exerts a high environmental burden. So when, or if we use an outdated notion of sustainability, which is made up of social, economic and environmental circles, if you like, and we think of trading them off between them, and where in reality we know that the economic ordinarily trumps all with recourse to claims of efficiency, it's time to ask, does sustainability still fit in the 21st century? It's worth reminding ourselves again that this term sustainability really derives from the 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, which drew our attention to the importance of thinking about future generations. But in the same way that Ireland has changed immeasurably since 1987, so has our understanding of what sustainability represents. It's simply more than a trade-off between these three broad concepts. For some of us who've been working on sustainability for some time, and here I'd like to give a shout out to my colleagues at UCC, because we've recently produced 2 books on the topic, we've come to appreciate, I think, in that respect, the need for a deeper, more robust conceptualization than the conceptualization that's been used hitherto. So I want to just pick out very briefly 3 points that I think should inform our understanding as we go forward. First, health, and Dr. Barry Walsh mentioned health in her opening remarks. Thinking about human, animal and planetary health are indispensable dimension of a reinvigorated sense of sustainability. And of course, these interconnections of these 3 dimensions have been made very, very clear by the emergence of COVID-19. A planetary health perspective helps us to frame the limits in which to live if we wish future generations, or even the young people of today, to have prospects of a safe and secure existence. The second dimension of a more robust conception of sustainability is the need for a holistic, transdisciplinary and systemic approach that recognizes the partial, contingent and variable nature of our understanding, and how we must build greater resilience and redundancy into our production and consumption practices. If that sounds like jargon, then let me put it to you this way. Foot to the floor productivism aiming to achieve ambitious export targets cannot be concealed by a cloak of sustainability. Third, finally, for the moment, is the changing ethical frame of reference. Again, if we contrast the Ireland of 1987 with what we see today, we see an utterly different ethical landscape. And in that respect, just think of the proposals for constitutional reform that have arisen from the Citizens' Assembly in their deliberations around particularly women's rights have really been transformative in that respect. Not to say the work is yet finished. But I would contend that ethical framework, that changing ethical framework, is also changing more broadly, more widely in relationship to our understanding of our place in the natural world. There is no longer a sense in which we have God-given rights to rule over the earth, but must begin to accept a relationship of coexistence with other species. This brings with it, of course, this recognition brings with it a responsibility to act on this understanding. So if we want to be leaders in an inclusive zero carbon future, we're not starting from the best place, but this is where we find ourselves, locked into a path-dependent thinking on producing often more high carbon agri-commodities. Now, this is not only environmentally problematic, I would argue that it could become more economically precarious. For notwithstanding efforts to prove the superior efficiency of grass-fed cattle, the evidence points to the fact that we have a highly specialized and unbalanced agricultural system oriented more to the outside world than to the domestic market. Ireland imports around 80% of its food, feed and beverage needs, amounting to over 10 billion euro of imports last year. Now that, I think, will surprise many people. And it reveals, of course, that the trade surplus on agri-food is smaller than we might be led to believe. And of course, this structure, this imbalance does not support domestically a sustainable, secure or healthy food system. Yet we persist with promoting agri-commodities that are increasingly the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism, if not here, then certainly overseas. In the first dialogue session, Laura Burke spoke of the serious reputational risk we face with continuing claims to being clean and green when the evidence is increasingly demonstrating otherwise. It's not rhetorical extravagance to anticipate that beef might soon be regarded as a toxic product, even to be represented, I argue, controversially, as the new tobacco. And this analogy may come as something of a shock, but the fact is that what we know about big tobacco's efforts in concealing the evidence that smoking is deleterious to health. But yet it's worth asking, which country achieved international recognition for its successes in tobacco control in the interests of public health? It's Ireland. And so how did it do this? Well, it did it through a combination of leadership and willingness to challenge vested interests in favor of the greater public good. So the food system, I would argue, needs public policy to regulate, restrict and incentivize, just as health-centered policies have rolled out smoking cessation supports alongside taxation measures, bans and so on. A food policy, not an agri-export strategy, brings our attention back to the domestic level and does so by joining up different elements of public policy that are too often disconnected. Health, of course, environment, planning, rural development, education, one could add to that list. And of course, an effective national food policy would find innovative ways to ensure the inclusion of many voices beyond that of business, such that citizens themselves can make themselves heard and thereby unleash the potential of participation, accountability, transparency, empowerment, and dignity. These elements enable us to embark upon the progressive realization of the right to food. As we move forward into the post-COVID era, there is much talk of building back better. Inevitably, in light of COVID, but also Brexit, priority is given to agricultural productivism, and the 2030 strategy is a means to boost economic growth. This is understandable. But any notion of building back better must involve a reimagination of our food system that is healthier, more sustainable, and inclusive. Clearly, this needs to begin by recognizing that any change of direction in agriculture must involve farmers in a way that does ensure a just transition. But a better food system also needs to embark upon a participatory dialogue with citizens. Many communities are waking up to the possibilities of being more engaged with their food. They want to assert a sense of agency beyond that simply as a consumer. There are a multitude of initiatives emerging, not only in Ireland, but around the world. Food is increasingly entangled with claims for greater social justice, cultural identity, and community empowerment. Calls for food sovereignty, the right of a peoples to determine their own food system, is now heard loudly and persistently in the corridors of FAO in Rome. I'm disappointed that it seems to be conspicuously absent from the agenda of the Food Systems Summit. Which brings me finally back to the real capital. We know that Cork is the food capital of Ireland for the history and quality of its produce, but it also has its share of deprivation and exclusion. Now, these are challenging issues, but one of the things that has been developed in Cork is an effort to try to use food as a way of enabling people to empower themselves through skills acquisition, through healthier eating, and through social connection. In 2013, we established the Cork Food Policy Council as a civil society organisation supporting interagency collaboration in helping to bring people together and to point a way forward towards a more sustainable local food system. We've had successes and setbacks, as all such initiatives face. And we've been a little disappointed that the City Council's been unable to provide more tangible financial support. But the exercise of working with the local authority has been instructive, I hope for them as well as for ourselves, and the outcomes have included much greater public engagement around food, with community gardens and other greening initiatives springing up around the city. Ultimately, it is at local level where we can make the most difference, but by fostering a sense of food citizenship. In Cork, we've barely begun to scratch the surface, but we see how rich and rewarding this work can be in helping to improve people's lives. While action is local, policy still needs to come from a national level, providing the incentives that support local efforts, but also guide population level impacts through impacts and restrictions. So to conclude, I'd say that food banks are unfortunately likely to be a fact of life for a while yet, but we should be working to reduce the numbers of people that present themselves for emergency rations, not celebrate the ever greater volumes of food waste that is being redistributed. This demonstrates a failure of a food system, not a success. This is part of the challenge that we face in working for greater contributive justice and inclusion in our food system. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr Colin Sage, for what was really a challenging and a provocative address, and we look forward to addressing a lot of the themes you've raised there with our panel. Let me introduce the first of them. Thomas Duffy is here in studio. He's the president of Macra na Feirme, which represents young farmers and young people in rural Ireland. Professor Anna Davies from Trinity College Dublin is Professor of Geography, Environment and Society. She also directs the Environmental Governance Research Group there. She's involved in several organisations such as Future Earth Ireland, the Rediscovery Centre, the International Science Council and the European Roundtable on Sustainable Consumption and Production. Also joining us today is youth activist Sophie Healy-Thau, who's co-chair of the UN Food Systems Summit Youth Liaison Group, so we're lucky to have you, Sophie. And in her activism, she promotes food security and gender equality. And she's a lead group member of the Scaling Up Nutrition movement and serves on the board of the charity ActionAid UK. And our fourth speaker on this panel is Carmel Fox. She's the chairperson of Goethe and of the Tipperary Town Revitalisation Task Force. She's also worked at the highest levels in Teagasc and been CEO of Ballyhora Development. I want to give you the results of our first Slido poll. Do you remember the question? How would you describe the connection between rural agri-food producing communities and urban consumers? And a pretty clear-cut result there. Excellent, very few of you think so, 4%. Good and getting stronger, only about less than a third, 29%. Good but declining, a third, 33%. Poor, urban consumers have no appreciation for agri-food products. And Anna Davies, I thought I'd go to you first on this question of that urban-rural divide. Obviously, a lot of people watching feel it's either declining or it's poor. So how we need to improve that and reimagine, if you like, our disconnect from food production in cities.
Yeah, it's a very good question and a very important one. As we know, today more than half the world's population live in urban areas, predicted to rise to about 70% by 2050. So positive action here is essential, not least because 79% of all food produced is destined for consumption in our urban areas. This obviously increases food waste as well, and with millions of urban dwellers categorised as food insecure across North America and Europe, that will have risen, a figure that would have risen during the COVID pandemic, all serves to confirm really that we're creating the need to create more sustainable urban food systems is necessary if we're going to go towards supporting a global food system. I think actually in certain places across Europe and North America, urban governments are already emerging as key actors in fostering sustainable urban food systems, although they usually have no clear mandate in this area. So developments are precarious and reliant on continued support from elected officials. I think Colin mentioned that in terms of his experience in Cork as well. And I think as noted in the EU's Food 2030 Pathways documents published last year, what's needed really is integrated cross-departmental action. Some cities are bringing together various stakeholders to design food policies that address pressing food-related problems such as food insecurity and obesity, but at the same time help to resolve wider issues, including environmental challenges, social inequalities and poverty. One thing I think that we could take inspiration from here in Ireland is the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which has been signed by over 200 cities worldwide, covering over 450 million inhabitants, and it's an important milestone in this context. However, no Irish cities are signatories to this pact currently. It's also important to emphasise that it's not only the sole responsibility of
across you there, Anna. So can you just tell us a little bit more about what that is? That Food Policies Pact.
Yeah, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact was developed by Milan government, city government, and was put together to bring a network of cities to come together worldwide to support sustainable urban food systems. But as I said, that no Irish cities are signatories of this pact currently.
That's an interesting point to make. And maybe, Carmel Fox, you pick up on that, because all of the work that you've done with rural communities and trying to sustain, if you like, sustainable development there. From your point of view and from that experience, what more needs to be done to develop that food citizenship and that link between urban and rural?
I suppose the first thing that I'd like to say is that there's a disconnect between young people in rural Ireland and food and where it comes from. So it's not a rural-urban divide. It's a rural and urban divide. And in very many schools, primary schools in rural communities, you'll find that there may be only one or two children that come from farming backgrounds. And at that, those children may know one form of production, but not the wider production. So I think it's very important that we expose people in all communities to where food is produced and how it's processed, and that sort of wider understanding of the need for more training around the use of food. And for sure, in rural development, food is an important element. And in the focus in that, on the one hand, there's the focus with schools and with the states around gardens, community gardens, school gardens, around more basic education. And then there's also the focus around training for people in terms of cooking their food. Because often this issue that there is with the fast foods being eaten is about giving people the skills to be able to produce that meal that takes less than an hour for their family. So that whole combined training is very important. And when we look at rural development, the added value in the food system is something that rural areas and rural people have proved themselves to be very good at. That's not quite answering that rural divide piece, but I do think that we need to see it not as a rural-urban divide, but as a divide where most people are not connected to an understanding of the production or processing of food.
I think it's a really important point that you make, Carmel, and I also find it so interesting that you're bringing us back to this question of education and also preparation for, assisting people, particularly with busy urban lifestyles. Again, if we want to develop this idea of food citizenship. Sophie Healy-Thau, I suppose on a panel like this, we hear so much about, young people will change the way food is consumed. They are driving the processes of change in our food systems. In your activism, having listened to Dr. Colin Sage there, having listened to our previous two speakers, how are young people demanding change and what changes are they demanding?
Yeah, so interesting. I would like to first reply a little bit to Mrs. Fox. And I think education is extremely important when it comes to food system transformation, but the education means nothing if access to those healthy, nutritious foods aren't there. And currently, a healthy, nutritious diet is a luxury in Ireland. And that is one of the greatest human rights violations to exist. It is a luxury to lead a healthy, nutritious life. And as a young person, I can say that leading that life is extremely hard when the cost of living is extremely high. So right across the globe, young people are demanding change, but we need change from others as well. Young people are doing as much as they can currently, and they are educating themselves on the topic. But if that access, that bridge isn't there, nothing is going to change. It has to be two-sided. All the responsibility can't be put on young people's shoulders. It's too much to ask, and it's quite unfair. We've seen our current food system contributes to ongoing health, climate and biodiversity crisis and violation of human rights. And we can only contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals with a decent and huge transformation of our food system. I wrote an article recently about Ireland's food security, and the comments underneath it were, Ireland is a wealthy country. Ireland is food secure. I can go to my fridge and access food whenever I want to. But just because Ireland is labelled as food secure doesn't mean everybody within Ireland is food secure. It doesn't mean everyone with Ireland is wealthy just because Ireland is a wealthy country. In my university campus, I have created a safe space with other students to talk about food insecurity on campus. And we hear from young people on a daily basis about how they have to go hungry to school because they just can't afford healthy food. And they know what's healthy for them. But if what's accessible to you when you come out of your lectures is a hot chicken roll from the local shop, what are you going to do? There's a lot of different complex factors within this. Last week I presented to the Special Envoy, Dr. Agnes Kalabata of the UN Food Systems Summit, about a youth initiative that I am co-leading, which will launch on the 18th of May, which is supported by Irish Aid. And she highlighted the importance of more youth-led initiatives and game-changing solutions, because young people like me, we're of today's digital age, but we're also perhaps more switched on and more connected than previous generations, the world around us, but also people of our own age around us. But we also deal with so many new challenges: fewer jobs on the market, school dropouts, COVID-19, climate change anxiety, mental health issues, and many others. And the combining factor, and the factor that really does connect us all, is food. And we need change at all levels and between all people.
So Thomas, I mean, from your point of view, representing young farmers, you know, when you hear all of this, when you hear the scale of change that's needed and required, is it daunting? Is it an opportunity? Where do you begin?
I think we can't really define whether it's daunting and or an opportunity. It's both of them.
Right.
The level of change that we absolutely need is massive. And one of the elements I think that we need to get our head around maybe a little bit, and I think it was kind of brought up in the keynote speech, which I don't necessarily agree with, is we are talking about a global or a massive community level movement, an EU level movement. Well, in agriculture and in food production, we are part of a huge community of people, namely the EU. And we trade. The reason that Ireland focuses on certain products is because we have both a climatic, but we also have an experience benefit. We can produce certain foods extremely well in Ireland. We cannot produce certain foods. If we want strawberries in December, which people have gotten used to, we're going to have to accept that we're going to have to trade between groups. But there are changes that we need to make. And
so
there are changes that we are
presumably
making.
Where you would disagree with Dr Sage is on the grass-fed cattle and export model. He was querying how sustainable that really is. You'd say it is within the EU?
Well, you see, the whole point he talked about sustainability and that there aren't trade-offs. Well, that would be wonderful and unlimited. But ultimately, what farmers are constantly being told, and really agriculture as an industry is carrying the heavy lift. Because to Sophie's point, and she's 100% right, a lot of students are struggling. Why? Because the other costs of living. So there isn't the money going towards food in Ireland. The percentage of our income that we're spending on food in Ireland is going down every single day. But the reality is, on the farmer side of things, there are greater expectations for more environmental sustainability, but there is no more money coming. The consumer is constantly saying, by and large, that they want more sustainable food, but the money is not coming back to the primary producer. We are having to work hard. Ireland does a wonderful job of saying exactly that. We are not saying that we are better than any other country in producing apples or in producing tomatoes, but we are saying, and we are rightly saying, that we are better at producing the products that we do produce in Ireland, a grass-fed beef and dairy.
Okay. I have another slide or question, by the way, for you. In an age when it's more difficult than ever to get reliable, trustworthy information across to young people, which of the following offers the best approach? Is it TV documentaries, social media influencers, more on food and school curriculum, that education point we were talking about earlier? Does it involve targeting parents and getting in at that young age? Or is it down to advertising campaigns? Again, let us know what you think and we'll feed it back in. Just to continue for a short while on this business of the beef model, the new tobacco, as Dr Sage called it, and the sustainability of the grass-fed cattle and export model. Which of our panellists would like to come in on that? Because Thomas was saying he believes within the EU it is sustainable. Does anyone disagree? Sophie?
Well, I don't agree that cattle and beef farming is sustainable long term. I think Ireland has a deep-rooted history in unsustainable farming practices, which is contributing to the degradation of our climate long term. I don't believe that that farmers are to blame. I don't think that it is a us and them issue. I agree with the speaker about there isn't enough money going to farmers for sustainable farming practices. So the reliance on historic unsustainable farming practices has had to continue because nobody wants our farmers to live a poor lifestyle. They are the connection, our biggest and most important connection to food, and they need to be treated as such, but with more emphasis on sustainable farming practices that are different to the ones we've seen.
And Carmel, given what you've seen in rural communities, how easy is it, because this is one of the themes, again, that's come up throughout these dialogues, how you have to get a local community, if you like, to buy into the process of change and how that's done. What's your own experience? What are the lessons or the pointers you would give in that direction?
I suppose the one piece that we all understand is that change is inevitable. And certainly local communities are very used now, and there's a system that's well understood of locally led development, where partnerships come together, consider a challenging issue, and work through to finding solutions. And I believe that there is scope for some of that within this strategy. And that could be across climate mitigation or renewable energy, across a range of things. But when you come back to looking at where is the biggest challenge in the strategy, I don't think the biggest challenge is actually in achieving change around climate mitigation or improved biodiversity. I think there will be a strong focus on those. I think there'll be mechanisms put in place that will support the delivery. And I have a strong belief that there's a changed conversation and a changed belief and buy-in. Where I see the greatest challenge is around the viability and resilience of the primary producer. For sure, that pressure is going to be put on, and like we can see, I got a leaflet that came through the door in the last week from Board Via, and they were talking about their carbon footprint champions, and they have 400 farmers that have reduced their carbon footprint by 18% in the last 3 years. More of that will happen. They're just some of the early adopters. But farmers need to be able to live viably. And the comment that was made earlier around the percentage of the income that's spent on food, I think needs to be thought about seriously. If you look back at the household budget survey back into the 80s or earlier, and you look at the percentage of that household budget that's spent on food, it's going down and down. And there is talk here about an equal distribution of margin across the different stages in the chain. Mm-hmm. But what we find in practice is the pressure is always put back down on the primary producer. And unless we find ways of dealing with that, we need to change from the cheap food policy. It's impacting producers all over the world. And until we put a proper value on food, we aren't going to be able to remediate the challenges in the system.
Thomas, presumably you'd agree with that. We need to be paying more for food?
Well, you see, again, to Sophie's point, here is the problem. There are some people who are not able to pay more for food. And we have this challenge. Agriculture is fundamentally the foundation of all of society. We did not develop stable societies until we developed agriculture. So if the general economy and the general of society is not able to sustain itself in that way, it will not be able to pay more. But certainly the percentage in the supply chain, we know that the more heavily processed food, and we've talked about, when we talk about beef, people often talk about these alternatives. I don't think people realise most of those alternatives are returning absolutely nothing really to the primary producer. They're based on commodity grains that are heavily processed, they're ultra-processed foods, and are then, at a huge markup for some of these companies. So this is the real major danger that we have. The primary producers won't be any better in the chain if we make all these additional changes for the climate. And in actual fact, and to that point, when we talk about climate action, there is no one who's going to be more negatively affected than primary producers. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are very concerned about rising sea level prices and in terms of heat, but nobody is going to be as affected as I am when drought hits my grass in the middle of May and I cannot let out my cows in April because it's raining too much and it's too cold. And that's just the simple reality. But the problem is, if we start talking about demonising certain foods, like was commented there, I mean, I have to entirely reject the suggestion that beef is tobacco, because in reality we know that beef does have a very positive nutritional contribution. It's a vital source of high quality iron. And yes, if you eat it in excess, in the same way if you eat too many grains in excess, you eat anything else. But tobacco produces no common good whatsoever. So to compare the two of them is just downright offensive to anyone with any bit of reasonable logic.
Anna Davies, this came up as well in our first dialogue, and it's interesting. Because one of the successes, if for instance in Europe since the Second World War, has been the fact that we were able to mass produce cheap food, and that was regarded for a long time in the 20th century as, you know, a great step forward. Now we're looking to do, as Colin Sage, you know, we're re-examining that whole model. But within that, the economics and the role of the primary food producer, because while there's so much talk of change, a lot of it will be driven from Europe and a lot of the incentives will come from there. But that insecurity that many primary food producers feel, particularly in Ireland, we do see it here in the beef sector, don't we?
Sorry, Hughie, what question did you have there?
So what are your concerns for the primary food producers? Because, you know, everybody in the cities who's consuming food is saying this is what we want, the change is coming, it's being driven by Europe, it'll be driven by the United Nations. But that point about the economics and the insecurity of the primary food producers in rural areas who feel that, you know, for instance, like beef farmers. So how do you address that?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one thing to say is that my research has primarily been focused on urban areas and looking at urban resilience and urban food systems. Absolutely agree with the comment that we need more security in sustainable livelihood for primary producers. Absolutely. I think we need to be clear that we're paying the true costs of the food that's produced, and would support what was said there regarding the problems of cheap packaged processed food. This cheap food is not doing us or the planet any good. We need to find better ways to value the contributions of the very diverse nature of food producers. I think it's sometimes a bit disingenuous to talk about farmers as a singular unit in an Irish context. There's very many different kinds of producers producing very different kinds of products. And I think, as it was mentioned earlier, focusing on resilience, diversification, supporting diverse food economies, both in urban, rural and peri-urban areas is important. Exploring the potential for shorter food chains, community-supported agriculture, where urban residents can support local farms to guarantee incomes which go directly to the farmers. There are lots of different experiments that could be used to try and support a sustainable livelihood for producers as well as consumers.
And can we do all of that while most of us in urban areas are popping down to the local supermarket and, you know, that's where you get your food? That is food to an awful lot of people. I know some of that changed during the pandemic. A lot of producers were able to make direct contact and direct deliveries and so on. But so does that model need to change?
Well, we need to find alternatives. I mean, I think that the notion of urban food growing needs much more serious attention. It's not considered in any substantive way in any urban food policy document I've read in an Irish context. I think the fact that no Irish cities are members of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact does indicate the low level of attention that's paid to urban food systems. And as I mentioned previously, you know, we are major sites of consumption, disproportionately consuming food in urban areas. We need to think about the resilience of our food systems within the urban area, as well as connecting more directly with producers. I mean, I think that in order to do that, we need to know what's already going on. There are already community gardens, urban allotments, community farms, community kitchens, and the like, but we don't know what scale, what contribution, what sustainability credentials they have. Much more attention needs to be paid to that, I think.
And it was interesting what Dr Sage was saying about their experience in Cork and the Food Policy Council there and working with the local authority and the need to develop those systems. Just to give you a result of that Slido poll, in an age where it's more difficult than ever to get reliable, trustworthy information across to young people, which of the following offers the best approach? TV documentaries only 5%, targeting parents only 8%, social media influencers only 21%, advertising campaigns 5%, but again the majority, whopping majority, 62%, saying more is needed on food in the school curriculum. And Sophie Thal, this is something that has come up again and again in terms of bringing food into the school curriculum and educating young people. And as we heard from Carmel, it needs to be in many rural communities as well as in urban communities. is that down to, this is what your food pyramid should be, or this is down to, this is how you grow the food, or this is science, or this, do you see what I mean? Because there's a lot we should have in school. What should they be learning in school? Should they be learning how to make an omelette? If you want, for instance, a cheap takeaway meal.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be taught about planetary health, and within planetary health, all those things align: sustainable meals, climate-friendly meals, what food actually means in a science sense, but also in a practical sense, what that means to how you should budget for your food even, or the best places to buy your food, or even how to grow your own food. I mean, I did home economics, and that in itself, I think, is detrimental to the education of young people within food. Calling it home economics, I think, is an injustice to the importance of our food system. In primary school, I contributed, or I was part of Food Dudes, that little pieces of fruit and veg came raw to us in plastic bags, and we just gave it to whoever liked parsnips on the day. These kind of things, although brilliant initiatives, don't really scale up or scale out as much as they are needed. I personally believe that the history of our food system, the future of our food system, and how we deal with our food system now shouldn't be an option. It shouldn't be something students can opt in and out of to learn about, because it could be detrimental to the future of our nation, but it also could be the saving grace of people, planet, and animal health into the future.
So the social, the historical, the scientific, and the ethical, as well as the practical. Just more on that, a question has come in on Slido. Is there a system we could introduce that encourages individuals or community groups growing or rearing their own food, and that people who can't afford food could actually, Anna, I'll give this one to you, and then I'll come back to you, Carmel. I mean, there is this idea that I know Cuba, because they had to. They've, because of difficulties with imports, they had to grow a lot of food in urban areas. But there's often this romantic idea, isn't there? A bit like what was that TV show with Felicity Kendall?
Good Life.
The Good Life.
The Good Life. Do you know what I mean? That somehow urban dwellers can have themselves their own little bit of the good life. I mean, that's one image, but in terms of a real transformation in cities, can you give us some examples of what you think would work?
And I think that there are inspirational examples internationally, although I would say there's no one urban utopia that we've come across. And also, I think it's really important to say that you can be inspired by examples internationally, but you simply can't cut and paste into different contexts. Places are unique in terms of history, culture, environmental conditions, relations to food. I think there's room for inspiration for sure, but actions need to be developed and embedded in local realities to be relevant. We need to take this food approach by examining not just food as fuel, not just food as commodity, but food as a social catalyst, a glue which keeps societies together and connects, provides social cohesion. And there's lots of ways we could do that. First of all, by mapping spaces, vacant spaces in cities, which could be used for food growing. We don't really know what the capacity is for our urban areas to produce sustainable urban food, and at what scale. And certainly increase in apartment dwelling means that it's not possible for people to do backyard gardening, but then there needs to be other spaces. And there are possibilities such as edible parks, as well as community gardens that you've mentioned, which could provide alternatives. Now, these require labour and maintenance and investment, but the social return on that investment and the sustainability return on that investment can be really spectacular, but we're not really exploring it yet, and there's much more work to be done. It's messy, it's distributed, but these are additional benefits of food systems that I think we need to consider.
Sounds as though local authorities have a lot of role to play actually in implementing all of this if it is to happen. Carmel, coming back to that question of the primary producer and the economics, and also their sense of being stakeholders in all of this process of transformation and change. It's about, going back to Thomas's question, how do we spread the cost of sustainable food? How do we share, if you like, the cost and the benefits across the chain? differently to the way we do now?
Yeah, I think that we do all need to take on board the inevitable change that's needed around climate and biodiversity. So that needs to be a fundamental underlying. And yes, all of the system, right through from the producer to the consumer, needs to take that on board. And I think it'll be driven by the consumer over time, and that change will be inevitable. But as we make that change, we need the science behind it to understand the changes that we're making. And I have an example. I was in a design school, and in the design school, and this is many years ago, they had 2 T-shirts up there. One of them was cotton and the other one was plastic. And they asked to know which of these had the bigger carbon footprint. It was the cotton. So we do actually need an awful lot more understanding of the decisions we need to make. And I think that's not only at the level of the primary producer, it's all the way along the chain. And when we take food, yes, the things that Anna has said, they're possible, they're positive, they take a lot of training, because the people that will be urban dwellers starting to produce in gardens need to learn how. They're very positive. And yes, there's potential for them to grow. But in the bigger sense, there's a big demand for food in the world. And we do need to recognise that we can produce that in a way that's more environmentally sustainable than most. And we need to compare and look at what's happening elsewhere. If you look at farming in Ireland, it's by and large family farming. If you start looking at the dairy farm comparison in the States, in other countries, you're looking, instead of the 100 cows here, you're looking at 4,000, 12,000, 18,000. You're on a completely different scale. So we do need to try to measure that environmental sustainability of what we're doing in real terms. Recognise the carbon sinks that we have, measure them. And I know that there's good work being done in looking forward and anticipating the information that's needed, in undertaking pieces of research and undertaking demonstrators, so that farmers and producers, processors can learn from them and can improve the systems that we have. But I think all along the way, while the policies need to be there, for sure, along with that, you need regulations for some of it, but then you need incentives. And those incentives need to go right through to understandings, training, knowledge transfer, and to improving the market chains, so that you are giving a fair chance for the different elements of the chain, particularly the primary producer, to get their margin.
Carmel, thank you. And I suspect, Thomas, you'd agree with a lot of that, but I also want to raise a question with you. And it's important on the island of Ireland not to forget our coastal communities, which we were discussing last week. Marine foods, again, are there opportunities for involving our coastal communities, marine food systems? Your take on that, and because obviously, you know, many people in those areas, we heard last week, they feel that, you know, the EU model is one that sold them short. So
I have to preference it by saying I'm from Cavan, so it's about as far away from the sea as is possible to get on the island of Ireland.
What part of Cavan?
Very close to County Meath, so I'm not too far away. But I suppose there are elements in the document which really, and it is great because in the document itself it recognises both young people working in the agricultural sector, land-based, and also in the marine. And there are a couple of elements because both the fishing communities and the agricultural communities are suffering the exact same thing, which is generational renewal disaster. And it is happening across the entire of the EU. In Ireland, only 5% of primary producers in agriculture are under the age of 35. while 6 times greater, 30%, are over the age of 65. We're seeing the exact same thing being exhibited in the fishing industry. It is very difficult to get people in because the costs are so huge. In agriculture, it's primarily access to credit and access to land. And in the fishing, it's simply access to fishing rights and accessing to the investment in capital-intensive industries. I think there is a potential.
So there need to be economic supports for young farmers to assist that generational change, the people who deliver all of the sustainability and novel food production that we're talking about?
Absolutely. There fundamentally needs to be 2 things. One, we need to get better at measuring these things, because unfortunately, even the figures that I can cite to you are from 2016. The European Commission, when it brought out its new Common Agricultural Policy, is still operating on 2016. We do not know in Ireland, and one of the elements which is being called out is Teagasc are beginning to research this and develop better metrics for us to go forward, because and we've talked an awful lot about changing systems. I mean, the biggest single change in the agricultural system in the last decade has been driven by Macro na Firma and other actors to move away from an inheritance model into more of a collaborative model. So, for instance, I'm in a partnership with my mother and my father. My sister is going to come on. So that both addresses generational renewal, but also the very heavy gender balance. Ireland is one of the worst places in the EU for female farmers. So we can do these things if the incentives are right and if the structures, but also very importantly, if policy is not working against us. And there are so many places where we just have contradictory policy. In one place we're being told, for instance, to cut down on artificial fertilizers, but then the products that we need to incorporate clovers are not there and are only being emergency licensed now. And I have to say well done to the Department of Agriculture for getting that across the line. But these are the difficulties, because if a young person, whether they're in the fishing industry or in the agricultural industry, is having artificial barriers put in place and blocking their way, then they will not change things. We've talked an awful lot about change here. The single biggest thing we can do for change is generational renewal, getting young people into the sector who will take up these opportunities, who will see these new markets and will adopt this new technology to meet the challenges, and was said very rightly, the major challenges of climate and biodiversity loss.
That's a point well made. And Sophie, maybe you'd pick up on that. And also, if, you know, Thomas is saying we've got to invest in young people, young farmers, young food producers, but also how we address the gender balance. What are your ideas?
Well, I have to admit it's the act of agriculture and fishing isn't my sector, but I do have some opinions. For example, I do think that the issues that the fishing industry are facing, especially in terms of Brexit, are much higher than the agricultural community is facing currently, especially when it comes to water regulations and areas in which they are allowed to fish. In terms of gender, I mean, we are seeing a historic legacy of land being given to male farmers, sons of people who own land. I have a friend who really wanted to go into agriculture and she couldn't. She had to go into another area because she just couldn't afford land, and it wasn't within her family to partake in agriculture. So I don't think that there is enough being done, if anything being done, to support women in agriculture, especially new women farmers within agriculture. But I believe somebody on the panel would have more to say than I would on this topic.
No, and actually I put that to you because I think it's important in this conversation that we talk about the others, because we're all coming from our own point of view, and it's picking up on that point that Colin Sage was saying about, developing some kind of citizenship framework where we're all understanding each other's points of view a little bit more. Final takeaway from you, Carmel. What are the main points you would say? Maybe getting back to that point about education that you were talking about earlier, and the need for it in rural communities as well, and what Sophie was saying about it needs to be, let's move well past home economics here.
I'm actually going to take a different take on the answer around education here. One of the big gaps that there is in the educational system, that there has been, is in training young people in farming skills. Right now, we have a really good system for training farmers, young people, to become farmers, to own their own farm, and manage their own farm. But what we don't have is a strong apprenticeship that trains young people that would like to farm so that they can go on to be either somebody that leases or rents land and takes over some other farm, or somebody that takes on a role as a herdsman or whatever on a farm. There's a big gap. There's an opportunity there. There's also a challenge, I think, in that gap for young farmers staying home to farm in Ireland, that there's often the need for them to come home quickly because of the shortage of labour, and they're not getting the opportunity to travel as much because there's this pressure at home for more labour. So I think from an educational point of view, I would very much like to see an apprenticeship training programme for people that come not necessarily from within the farming sector, but from outside it, for jobs that are very available in agriculture. So maybe not the kind of question you had expected me to answer.
A really interesting answer, and thank you so much. It's a really good point, that one about the apprenticeships. And a final point from you, Anna. It sounds to me from what you were saying, there is a huge role for city local authorities, local politicians, to start seeing themselves, to start building food into their politics, into their plans for their areas.
Yeah, that's right. I think, ultimately there needs to be a long-term political commitment to sustainable urban food, appropriate funding, both from city and national government to support the agenda. We need a local level empowered competencies which is supported at the national level, and a way for departments within local authorities to work together, synergies across department around food. And finally, I think the more participatory policy processes are required to ensure that we get different perspectives included in deliberations to help share ownership and promoting innovation capacity. And I'd just like to support the argument for apprenticeships around growing both urban and rural farmers.
Thank you all. It's fascinating stuff. You've all thrown up so many ideas, and I know we've only skimmed the surface on an awful lot of them, but thank you, if you like, for your big thoughts and thinking big and sharing your thoughts with us today. In a moment, I'm going to be introducing you to our second panel, when we're going to be talking about the appliance of science to achieving better food systems. And we're also going to have our Slido questions. We want to know what you think about a couple of key points that we'll be discussing with our panel. So we've our third poll question for you now. And that is, which area of research and innovation in agri-food requires the most attention to address key food system challenges by 2030? So we'll be really interested in your response on this. Is it food authenticity and safety systems? Is it fisheries and aquaculture? Is it nature-based solutions and circular economy approaches? Is it healthy and personalised nutrition? Is it genetic improvements? So please let us know what you think on all of those, and we'll be feeding the results of that poll into our discussion with our panel presently. I also want to tell you about the fourth dialogue of this series. That's going to be taking place on the 17th of May, the 17th, not next Monday, so pop that date into your diaries. Our chair on the 17th will be Rory de Bourke. He's Director General of Irish Aid at the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the theme that afternoon, because we've had very much a domestic focus for today's dialogue and the previous two, but the theme that afternoon is how we align domestic and foreign policy to achieve the goal of more sustainable food systems. And once again, we're going to have some great speakers for you, including keynote speakers, Dr. Susanna Moorhead, who's chair of the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD, and Dr. Jamie Morrison, Director at the Food and Agriculture Organisation. And the public consultation on the National Agri-Food Strategy remains open until June. So just go to gov.ie/consultations. And now, by the magic of science, we have our new panel in place for you. So please let me introduce them. And Dr. Maeve Henshin is Principal Research Officer with Teagasc. She's here in a personal capacity today. She's on the board of the Food Safety Authority and on the executive of BioOrbic, Ireland's bioeconomy research Centre. She's also involved with the SCAR Food Systems Working Group. Her interests are innovation in the circular bioeconomy and sustainable food systems. Joining us remotely, Dr Nora Caldy is founder and CEO of Neuritas, which uses technology to get the most from nature. Their aim is new discoveries that could benefit the lives and health of billions of people globally. Alvin Hunt is the co-founder and chief executive of Hexafly and Irish Agritech. His mission to revolutionise the way we feed this world by breeding insects on an industrial scale and doing that sustainably as well. And Professor O'Connor is the director of BioOrbic, the Science Foundation Ireland Bioeconomy Research Centre at UCD. He's also set up two companies, Bioplastec and Nova Mentis. So a huge amount of brain power on this panel, and you're all very welcome. And Maeve, maybe you'd kick us off with this question of the appliance of science and this brave new world of food that's coming to us. And, you know, we know the strategy, we know what we're all trying to achieve, and we want it to be circular, we want it to be sustainable, we want it to be affordable, accessible, ethical. How close are we to doing all that, and what do we need to be focusing on, in your view?
Well, I suppose, yeah, there's a lot we're asking from the system there. And I suppose I don't really want to throw cold water on things from the outset, but I suppose the important thing to recognise that absolutely science and technology has brought us a huge way. We're producing a lot more milk, say, with less inputs and less environmental impact than in the past. We have fantastic developments with new technologies around adding value to co-processing and waste streams. But I think we have to recognise that science and technology can only bring us some of the way. And therefore, I think that then speaks to the argument for the food systems approach. And I suppose the point that I would make then around relating to that is we have to understand we're not just simply about trying to develop new technologies and new crops, we're trying to develop new systems. And that ultimately means change. We have to understand the different relationships and interconnections that are there. We have to understand that we require changes in power, we require changes in mindsets. And then I would argue that we need a much more stronger emphasis on the social sciences in terms of understanding all of that change and facilitating the introduction of new science and technology solutions to the food system then.
Yeah, there is an awful lot of education and explaining that's going to have to go on to bring, you know, stakeholders right across the society with us, isn't there? I mean, that's one thing that's been coming very clear. Nora Caldy, talk to us, though, about the brave new world of food production and looking at food or food elements in a different way and using new technology, because we've been hearing so much about, you know, people's poor diets, how food is making us sick, how people can't afford food. So talk to us about the appliance of science and how that can help, and your work in Neuritas.
Yeah, thank you. So it's incredible. Yeah, food has really become a problem, okay, and it shouldn't be, because food is really the solution to all this, but it hasn't been used the right way. And the realization that we know very little about food and how food interacts with the human body was a big thing for myself as an academic initially. Realizing that, you know, if you take a plant, you're talking about trillions of different molecules within that plant. To understand what molecule does what and how it interacts with the human body is just a huge mathematical problem that currently humans have not really understood. So we're not really close. A few years back, about 10 years ago, we weren't really close to understanding the complexity of food and how we extract health benefits from it. And this is why introducing new technologies to old areas like food and food production is very important, because we live in a data-rich world. And the question is, how do you use that data and how do you integrate new technologies to decipher that data better and to understand it better? So if I give you a concrete example, if you take any source material, let's say a plant, and you eat it, you lose a lot of the health benefits within that plant. So even if you eat it fully, so as a whole foods, you lose a lot of benefits, a lot of health benefits that are in the plant. But when you digest it, you lose a lot of it. You get the nutritional part, but a lot of the very specific health benefits you lose. Also, when that whole foods is processed to create a finished product, a lot of those health benefits are also destroyed throughout the production. So what we did was try and understand, well, how can we identify those incredible health benefits that are hidden for hundreds of millions of years in all sources, in all plants around us, in all marine sources, etc. And how do we make them available to humans so that we can use food to its full power? We can use plant to its full power, because currently, there's a global clear augmentation in the number of people, there's need for more food, but actually we're not using food to its full potential, even what we have currently. So the fundamental understanding of what's in source materials, what are the health benefits there that we're losing as humans, how can we make them more available, how can we take those ingredients that you then create and put them into different food sources, into different food products, to improve human health, has been really the mission we've been on for a while. So like I said, there was no way to identify these incredible benefits within food without actually realizing, without doing it through computer science. And just another example, a more concrete example, let's say you take fava bean, okay? What we discovered recently in fava bean is a network of different molecules, short proteins called peptides. So they're short proteins within fava bean that when you eat the fava bean itself, you don't get their power, but the power of these peptides improve muscle health. Now, muscle, people don't think about it much, but muscle is the major organ within the human body. It is the organ that we use to move. It is our metabolic heart, our energy heart, it's the first aging part as we sag. That's really to do with muscle aging, and the performance of it is very important. And it really is key to our health and well-being for a long period of time. So what's interesting is that there's currently no real solutions to improve the fundamental health of muscle. And what we did over the past few years is try and identify solutions for muscle in nature. And we found a network, like I said, of peptides, which are short proteins in fava bean, that really tremendously, significantly shift the muscle from an aging muscle to a healthier, younger muscle. And I won't go into more science than that, but basically those benefits would have been lost if you did eat the fava bean on its own. And obviously the fava bean went through a food processing, the same thing would have happened. So in a nutshell, food should be the solution. We're not using it the right way. And the fundamental understanding of what's in food, what's in our plants around us, plants and other sources, is really important to be able to structure and create better products, healthier products with the same taste using new technologies.
That's absolutely fascinating stuff, and I wouldn't even have to shell the fava beans to get all the benefits. I could just take you a supplement. Besides which, the idea of broad beans being the new Botox, I'm still kind of getting my head around that. Talk to me about the business of trying to, farming insects, we've all heard somewhere, in the future we'll all be eating insects because they're so nutritious. Most of us don't want to. You decided to go into it as a line of business, but it's such a fantastic concept. We know it is the future, but what's your practical experience been of trying to get a fly factory off the ground?
Yeah, well, it's a new industry. Doing something that's, I suppose, new and innovative is always going to be difficult and challenging.
Did people tell you were nuts?
A few people did, yeah. I suppose when we started, it was really kind of early stage. The industry was only really getting started globally at that stage. So like there's been a lot of, there's a lot in the media about insect farming now, and it's received huge amount of investment since. But when we started, it was very much at the conceptual stage. Even, there had been a lot of scientific research, but as a practical solution, it was still quite early.
And come here to me, Alvin, why did you want to go into flies instead of beef, for instance?
So we were looking at, I suppose, the future population growth is going to be an extra 2.2 billion by 2050. The demand for protein, not just for the human population, but actually on a more practical level for animals, the need for protein to be used in animal feed. And we saw that there was industrial, the agri sector and the industrial sector were predicting that there would be shortages and there would be a gap there in that protein production. So we looked at insects. Insects are really, really high in protein. For example, like the insect we use, black soldier fly, it's got 60% protein. The insects had a 2.5 week life cycle, quick turnaround. They were able to take in raw material food waste that we produce, that's produced in society, and instead of that being discarded, they can actually
Did they have any favourites?
They do, yeah. They certain foods or waste streams they prefer. Stuff of vegetable or vegetal origin is quite good. Distillery byproduct as well, certain grains and things like that.
There's a surprise. So what was the experience? I mean, was there local support? Was there official support? What was your experience?
So it was challenging. So there was two elements to it. There was getting the investment in the first place. That we were able to do over time. Then there was obviously the legislation side of things as well. So actually, when we started the business, there was no legislative framework to grow or farm insects at all. So we were kind of in this really kind of strange grey area.
Where it was kind of, did you even know it was legal?
Well, it was in America, and we thought, well, what's going on in Europe? Then we realised, look, there was big moves at a European level to bring this, to bring this into law for aquaculture and pet food. So we were following those developments. But when we were in Ireland and we were looking for, well, what license do you even need for this? That type of thing. So that was challenging because there was no framework in place when we started to go. But then the European Commission passed a lot of the legislation, and then we were able to work with something. But it was challenging. It took a long time to get the approvals we needed. But I suppose there was learnings there on both sides. There was no use case. There was no.
It was a learning on the official side as well.
It was learning on both sides for sure.
And there's going to have to be a lot more of that in the years ahead, isn't that right? In all kinds of areas.
I think so. I think like technology moves at a very quick, very fast pace. Innovation is moving fast. The solutions we need we need them now. So legislation and regulation needs to there needs to be a matching there of how that can fit in together from a timeline perspective. Obviously, there's the commercials of trying to get things going versus balancing the health and safety and the regulation side of things. But it has worked out. We're approved and we're growing as a business, and globally the business is insect farm is expanding at a rapid rate. So it's a good solution, I think.
Okay, it's absolutely fascinating stuff, and fair play to your innovation. And Kevin, just talking actually before I come to you, the question I'm going to give to you is to look for a reaction to our Slido poll, which was which area of research and innovation in agri-food requires the most attention to address key food system challenges by 2030. Was it food authenticity, traceability and safety systems? 13% thought so. Fisheries and aquaculture, only 8%. Healthy and personalised nutrition, 16%. Genetic improvements, only 5%. But nature-based solutions and circular economy approaches were a whopping 58%. What is a circular economy in food production? And how does research and development need to play into that? Can you hear me, Kevin?
I can hear you, sorry. Just went blippy there, for I'm at home and my internet connection isn't great. It's a big question. What is a circular economy and how can it feed into our food system?
Because it is one of those big terms that's thrown around, so I thought it would be useful to break it down.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose right now we live in a linear economy. We take something out of the ground, like fossil-based resources, oil, gas, we convert that into something. That something can be fertilizer, actually, and that fertilizer goes into a field. But it's a make, break, throw away society. That's what we have. That is a linear economy. The circular economy is trying to take our resources and say, okay, let's keep them in the material cycle. Let's keep them in the economy for as long as possible. Let's try to design them so that they can be reused. Let's make them so that they can create as much value and as many jobs as possible. Let's create them so that they don't generate a huge amount of waste. Let's create them so that we are ultimately reducing the amount of energy that is used to make them or to reuse them. So it's a holistic view of how we use materials and the impact the use and creation of those materials is having. So a circular economy should ultimately reduce our footprint. It should reduce our impact on the environment while still creating jobs, creating wealth, and ultimately contributing to sustainability.
And it is the only way we're going to be able to feed more people on this planet without burning it up, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, we absolutely have to think circular in our thinking. And in food production, someone mentioned it earlier, I think someone mentioned earlier, but 30% of the food that we produce goes to waste. It never gets to be consumed. It's never consumed by a human being. So we have a massive, I think Nora said it, you know, that we're not getting the best out of our food. Well, we're not only not getting maybe the interesting molecules that Nora's looking for, but we're also not getting efficiency in our food systems. And actually, a lot of that isn't down to agriculture. Agriculture is actually quite efficient at production. It's the supply chains after that. Yeah, and it's our 2-for-1 offer, the 3-for-1 offer. Have I stopped?
No, we're still hearing you. Go on, Kevin. Yeah. Oh, no, hold that thought then, and we'll come back to you.
I'm still there. Sorry.
No, that was a really interesting point you were making, if you still hear me, about the inefficiency in the food systems, if you like, being beyond the farm gate.
Yeah, so...
no, we'll see if we can improve that. Just hold there the line, Kevin. We'll see if we can sort that out a little bit. Before I'll come back to you on that, Maeve. But before I do, I want to give you another Slido question, which is: research and innovation can make the biggest contribution to achieving a sustainable food system. Do you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or disagree, or strongly disagree? And this is how much this question of how much uncomfortable change do we have to make in our own lives and the way we do business now, Maeve, isn't it? Compared with how much will, you know, somebody like Nora come along with a way of using artificial intelligence to get the most out of a fava bean and new products.
Sorry, Anya, what's the
just
question?
On the balance there.
The balance of the change in the system, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think there's huge potential for change all along the system. And we did some work recently looking at the opportunities to add value to co-processing streams in the meat industry. And we found there's about at least 250 potential opportunities there that we can look at valorising into the future. But maybe I can come back a little bit as well and speak to the point about the role of livestock production in the food system. And Teagasc is actually organising an independent dialogue around that in parallel with the national dialogues, I suppose, to try and bring a bit of balance to the argument around it.
Because it was interesting, our Slido posters weren't that impressed by genetics as being, you know, the answer. And a lot of farmers are saying we'll be able to breed, you know, a herd that will produce much less biomethane, and genetics is crucially important to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, genetics is part of it, and then feeding strategies are all part of it as well. But I think the point I was trying to make is that we have to look at what are cattle actually doing. And, you know, we have the point here that insects are converting non-human edible food into feed, or food for humans. Cattle are actually doing the same thing. So they're converting non-human edible food, grass, into food for humans. And they also have a significant role in terms of eating, you know, distillers' grains and things like that in the past. So they have a huge role there as well. So I think we have to think about the role of livestock beyond producing food. They have a role in we had the Burn example last week, whereby if you didn't have those cattle wintering, you would have overgrown scrubland, you would have negative environmental impacts. We have the significant role that grasslands play with regards to in the uplands in Wicklow, for example, there's a grass called Millennia. If that's not grazed, you will have the forest fires that you have, the wildfires that you have at the moment as well. So livestock have a role in all of these ecosystem services. And I think it speaks to your poll also about the natural, nature-based solutions that are there, and livestock can be part of that. But it's about trying to figure out where it fits in the overall food system is something that we need to consider. It's not the tobacco of the industry. It's part of the solution, and it's trying to figure out where it fits is where there may be a bit more balanced debate is required.
And Alvin, I never asked you, what do you do with your flies once you've produced them? What happens to them then? Yeah,
so we have our own, one part of the factory would be the breeding section. So that's where the adult flies mate. So we extract the eggs there. That's in a very temperate, humid climate, extract the eggs. And then
How hard is it to get an egg out of a fly?
Well, you have to have an attractant and get them to lay in a specific area, and it is very, very tricky. There's a lot of IP and science behind it, but we've cracked that. So then after that, what we do is we take those eggs and then they're brought to a hatchery where they grow out into kind of a juvenile larvae, and then they're moved into a bigger incubation room. And at those two stages, they're introduced to the feedstock or the food waste, and over the course of about 7 to 10 days, they will completely bioconvert that. They will grow in over 2,000 times their size from egg. And then what we do is we separate a certain percentage of the larvae at that stage to go back into the original, into the breeding,
Circle
so that the
of life all over again,
keeps going. And then the rest of the larvae then are separated from the feedstock that they've eaten. So they've eaten that feedstock, and what's left over is a material called frass, which is an organic fertilizer, which can then be used locally in agriculture or in horticulture. And when they have been screened then with that sieving process, they're then processed and separated into oils and proteins. So the protein is about 60% protein, and then the oil is very similar in its composition to coconut oil. It's almost exactly the same, actually. So that's kind of the process of how it works.
So I could be rubbing myself with fly oil in years to come?
Well, look,
or cooking with it?
It can certainly act as a sustainable replacement for palm oil, which, as we know, is its production leads to deforestation worldwide. So look, there's a host of environmental benefits associated with insect farming. It's a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to other forms of agriculture. It has the ability to convert the food waste that we're producing, and it can do that en masse. Ireland produces about 1 million tonnes of food waste annually. If we were to build a much larger insect protein plant in Ireland, we could convert about 15% of all of Ireland's food waste. So there's great opportunities there. It's a vertical farming system, so you're growing up as opposed to needing lots of land. There's very little water being used, no antibiotics, and it's a zero-waste system. So
apart from the fact that I have a big ugly fly as an image in my head, it sounds completely virtuous and circular, and something that we could only want more of. And Nora, it's interesting, isn't it? How good do you think in Ireland we are at embracing the novel, the scientific? When we talk about, food production and food sustainability, and we think of green Ireland, and, green fields, and it's all very natural and bucolic, as opposed to scientists in laboratories, pressing computer buttons.
I think Ireland is doing well. I think Ireland is doing well. Globally, it's not the case. You can see this, huge pandemics like diabetes and other blood pressure and so forth. And then that is caused again by the types of foods we're eating and our lack of knowledge of how to use food properly and how to consume it properly. And also the types of products that are produced. And I think, for example, now there's this whole movement from meat into plant-based. And that lack of understanding of proper plant-based is scary, because a lot of the products are now plant-based products. You look at the labels and you're like, wow, this is really super processed, and what's healthy about it, but there's still this connotation of, well, it's plant-based, so it is healthy. It's healthier than meat. And I think that kind of misunderstanding, needs to really start being talked about at all levels, and I don't think it's talked about enough.
And actually, that's a really, really important point. Certainly, I know these are arguments that have gone on in my household, where you have people, thinking that they're eating a much greener diet, and half of it's coming in the door in cartons from the supermarket, and I'm up the allotment bringing home homegrown vegetables, and they won't eat them. So anyhow, that's a sore point with me. But it does raise that issue of, there's a lot of young people growing up, and they're picking up. This is the age of, we can all get information about everything on our phones, TikTok, Google, whatever. But that's not the same as the kind of scientific knowledge and understanding you're talking about. And there's a big disinformation gap sometimes in between, isn't there?
Yeah, it's going to be, though, because, food and consumers are moving towards this knowledge-based consumer, okay, together with mobiles, apps, etc. We now know more, and a lot of it is better integrated, and technology moves really fast. So I think from a technology perspective, we'll get there really quick, where we can scan products and we'll know what types of ingredients are in them, if they're healthy or not. I think all that will be very soon available. And food now is also becoming a knowledge-based industry because of that, and it has to become it. And there'll be losers and winners, and I think the losers are going to be the ones that aren't going to follow the trends and just, you know, rely on marketing, heavy marketing, and ones that are going to really understand that this is coming, that, you know, adaptation of their products with you know, ingredients that are going to have support behind them, have real scientific support, that are sustainable, natural, and all the boxes that our consumers are looking for, but also have the scientific support behind them, is crucial for now. And yes, there's this gap that still lies between what is healthy and what is not healthy. And I think governments should play a very important role in educating this. And also, I think this might be out of nowhere, but if you look, for example, at the differences between Africa, Europe, between South America and the US, it's all, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is, how do we extract health benefits that are cost effective, that can be put into food, and that are going to help individuals have nutritional, healthy products and stay healthier for as long as possible. Because you don't want to, you know, live longer, but actually stay in a disease state for most of it. So how do you live through nutrition and food? Because literally it's the one thing you do every single day. And really, at the end of the day, it's identifying the right components, allowing companies to take that on board and develop these products. And from a government perspective, I'm thinking about it, like, Ireland is a small country. It could really start this trend and be a pioneer in this area, where it could get a few food companies to really start developing these types of products, because the solutions are there. It's just they haven't been integrated. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Point very well made, Nora. Really, I was just drawing a breath.
Because
there.
why not? Yeah. Because the solutions, like, literally the ingredients are there. It's just that there is no pressure on food companies, I think, to do so. Now, there is mounting pressure globally, but there's still no pressure for governments to say, okay, well, let's look at this, you know, and let's create alternatives that are really healthier, as opposed to ones that there's a mirage of things around and you feel they're healthier, but they're not really.
And Kevin, that point about getting, because, you know, picking up on the point you'd made, do we still have Kevin with us? I hope you can hear me at this stage. Or
I can hear you.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Because that point you were making earlier about the inefficiencies being less on the farm and actually more within the food system, marrying that to that point Nora made there about the need for more of our food companies to become pioneers in this area. And it's really interesting. Final point for you to consider here. Our Slido poll strongly agreed, 55%, that research and innovation can make the biggest contribution to achieving a sustainable food system. So how do we get that in our food industry, if you like, beyond the farm gate?
So I think you're right. The opportunity is huge. I think people tend to play safe. So the food industry is no different. They know what works for them. And so driving innovation in large organizations, and we have some very large organizations as food companies, driving innovation can be very difficult because innovation places them at risk. So what we really need to do, again, I think.
No, we're still hearing
but I keep
you.
talking. Yeah. So what I think to drive innovation, you need to start at the educational system. You need to at the undergraduate level, at the postgraduate level, you need to design courses that are actually going to teach students about how you can change, how you can be an entrepreneur. I think being an entrepreneur is, I think it's genetic, but you can train people to be better entrepreneurs. So I think that's really important, that we can, the next generation, like we in Biorbic are trying to train the next generation of thinkers. That's not easy because sometimes, you know, the old phrase, diamonds are dulled and pebbles are shone. So to drive innovation, what we need is an educational system that allows people to take risks, and actually we're not afraid of failure. Nora mentioned America there. The Americans aren't afraid of failure. Europeans are. One of the things that limits innovation in our current ecosystem is our fear of failure.
That's a really, really interesting point there, isn't it? And also that point that was being made, Maeve, about, you know, we have a lot of, you know, very well-known big food companies, but also the education and rethinking that has to go on there in terms of innovation and in terms of being maybe, you know, embracing of risk.
Absolutely, and I think maybe, you know, Kevin and myself, we've been around a while, but I think even we need to be re-educated as well in terms of how we work together in the scientific community. You know, we operate a lot in silos. You know, you have the geneticists and the physicists and the microbiologists and the social scientists, but we all need to learn how to work together, because unless we do, we're not going to address these grand challenges that we need to address. So we need to educate ourselves as well to learn each other's languages and to work together. And to speaking to Kevin's point about failure as well, if we're thinking about the food system, we don't exactly know if we change one thing, how it's going to impact on another. So we have to accept we're not going to have all the answers, and we have to accept, and you know, we won't have the scientific evidence for all of the actions we're going to take. So we have to do these at a small level, take the risk, and implement them and learn from them. And you know, we're not going to have the evidence base for everything. We're going to have to take some risks, accept some failures, learn from them, and move on.
Well, you've certainly been willing to do that, Alvin. What would you say the biggest message you would have for, you know, people who are part of this conversation, watching online, talking about the Food Strategy 2030, getting ready for this big UN Systems Conference in September? What are the key things you think we need to take on board? What are the key points you'd make?
I think improving the efficiencies from the consumer point of view, in terms of the food waste. Like, we produce 1 million tonnes of food waste annually per annum. That's
your flies could certainly use some.
Well,
yes.
Absolutely. I mean, looking at other technologies, you know, improving efficiencies in agriculture, improving the type of ingredients that we use in our food systems. And, you know, I think overall lowering the emissions where we can, and doing so in a practical, sustainable way, both for the farmers and also for society as a whole. But being willing to look at alternative radical solutions to problems that don't necessarily look like they're an issue now, but are an issue down the line, you know, in the decades to come, and will hit us hard if we don't try and tackle them. So, you know, bold types of alternatives are needed. So I suppose I would say, you know, generally that we need to be very open to looking at what we can do to change things in the years ahead.
Boldness, a willingness to embrace risk. And it's back as well, I'll give the final word to you here, Nora. It's back as well to that crucial need that's going to be needed right across society for people to understand all of this better. If all of the different groups, the consumers, the producers, the companies, the researchers, are to be brought along the same road together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I use an app that my dad actually uses, and just to show you where technology is going, you know, and you just scan your product in the supermarket, and you can go into as much detail as possible. So what it can do, it tells you, well, these are the ingredients, and it scores them by color. So it tells you orange is not great, red is really something you shouldn't be eating. I mean, every ingredient within the product, and then it scores the full product. And some of the products you really associate with being, you know, they're not that healthy, but they're not bad, are in the red zone. Even for me, I was surprised to realize that, you know, there was a lot of additives and ingredients that we shouldn't be eating at all, and they should be removed completely. And then what's interesting is that you can compare products. So it will tell you, well, you should be eating this one. Here's a healthier version. And that's where things are going. And it's that full integration of different data sets from different worlds, from, you know, health, biology to ingredients, to research papers, and bringing it down really to a final finished product. Now, you know, these are still at the early level, but these types of technologies are going to very quickly grow as they access more and more data and more consumer data. So things are going towards there. So I think it's time now to realize this and really make a difference, because it's not a major leap. It's not like where it's small differences are going to make much better, healthier products.
Exactly. And, you know, people have the capacity to absorb all this information. Just look at how much we know about spike proteins on coronavirus at the moment. We can name them all off by number, and none of us could do that a year ago. Thank you all very much indeed for a really enjoyable panel. And once again, I'd like to thank all of our panellists and contributors today. And particular thanks to all of you watching for sending us your comments and questions and taking part in our Slido polls. Don't forget to join us for our last National Dialogue. That's going to be on the 17th of this month. But now, to conclude this afternoon's session, I'll hand you back to our chairperson, Dr. Paula Barry-Walsh.
I would like to thank Dr. Colin Sage for his enlivening keynote speech and all of our panellists for their thoughtful interventions. My thanks also to all of you who put questions to the panels. As chair, it's extremely difficult to encapsulate the wealth and breadth and differing opinions from the discussions in my remaining time. But I wish to reflect some key points that struck me as I listened to the questions, the answers, the ideas, and the debate. I have three main reflections. Firstly, the need for us all to listen to each other, to hear what we're saying, and to involve all citizens and communities across the generational spectrum in this discussion has been established. Secondly, the key role of research and innovation. And finally, the potential of the circular bioeconomy to be part of the transformation and reframing of our food system, and how there is need to change our own perception of what waste is. I will speak to each of these points in turn. Firstly, none of us can be in any doubt that there are solutions out there. Research solutions, blended solutions, practical solutions, market solutions, and also difficult and radical solutions. But to gain those solutions, we need to be open to including all citizens, even where their questioning is of an uncomfortable and disruptive nature. The challenges are manifest. Are we committed to the inclusion of all citizens and their views in searching for a just transition? The value of grassroots movements to bring about change was emphasised by our keynote speaker. We also heard mention today of a new word, food sovereignty. Are we listening? Do we understand it? A radical shift of thinking was promoted to question ourselves on what sustainability means in our own agri-sector, particularly the beef model. But it was also established that sustainability has costs, and will those costs be shared equitably if this new paradigm does benefit all of us? And how do we enable and empower those communities to be part of the just transition? Perhaps we need to formulate a vision on how that may occur. There is full agreement that producers need to be economically viable, but there's discussion to be had on the value of food versus a cheap food policy. Youth do have a role in reimagining our food systems. The ethical framework of the future, it mentioned that we need reference points. Where will we be setting those reference points? We hear diversity and conflicting views. What is truly hopeful is that while we do not even know the questions, never mind the answers, there's a real sense today of strong commitment for people to work together across the generations and geography and across the spectrum of citizens in search of those remedies. One of the learnings from COVID-19, and articulated so well in the keynote speech and in other dialogues, is the interlinkage of food, community, culture, and values. There is expectation that food is not only safe and authentic, but that it is sourced in an ethically acceptable way, one that respects our planet, the producer, and for food of animal origin, the welfare of that animal, and our growth and production systems. The important role of women as drivers of change, particularly in farming and fishing, was also referenced. But we need to consider dramatic shifts to increase the percentage of women in our agriculture. In Ireland, currently under 10%. The role of youth, their ability to see the planetary problems in an immediate and citizen-oriented manner, allied to their energy and creativity, will be hugely positive in terms of asking fearless questions and holding policymakers to account. This is essential. Truly, we do not own this planet, but only hold it for the next generation. But we do recognise the willingness of youth to step up to leadership roles, but they cannot be held accountable for all the future. Secondly, as expected, there is appreciation and expectation around the role of research and innovation to unearth evidence that will inform solutions, ones that can be tried and tested to enable change. But we also heard of the risks allied to such innovation, such research, and the risks of failure, the costs of failure, and indeed unintended consequence. However, research is very much in keeping with Ireland's own ongoing use of research to currently provide positive and impactful results in the sphere of agriculture. Examples to name a few include the Vista Milk Initiative, Teagasc work on the profitability of grass-fed dairy calf to beef systems, or work ongoing by ICBF in Teagasc to reduce the emissions profile of the Irish cattle herd through improved genetics. These discussions reflect the need for a strategic approach for the funding for research and development, one that recognises the value of government-supported research, public-private research initiatives, as well as private research. But science is not black and white. We know again well from our COVID experience that science can be interpreted, misinterpreted, disbelieved, and cherry-picked. So that knowledge, that journey from knowledge to application of science is a treacherous place where others may seek to fill the space. In the context of novel foods such as insects being provided in Ireland, one can detect the cultural shift that forms part of the challenge for innovators and those who seek to radically move the dial on our food habits. Thirdly, the potential of the circular bioeconomy to change our perception of what waste is, not just for the economic or environmental sustainability provides, but its essential role as part of the social sustainability paradigm, its regeneration capacity, where the waste of all will have value to society, whether it be fertiliser, feed, heat or other. It is not inaccurate to say that our Irish bioeconomy is in its infancy, but today we've had a glimpse of its potential and can foresee that will be integral to the transformation process over the next 10 years. In relation to emerging industries, the difficulties faced by the insect industry tell us that the entrepreneurial spirit requires resilience and tenacity. Regulation may seem intrusive on such innovations, and some reflections were given on that point. Fundamentally, it points to the needs for enablement of new industry by policymakers, but also a mechanism for entrepreneurs to gain insight into the regulatory regimes we have that are the backbone of Ireland's world brand for its food products. But all of the above will not and cannot progress in isolation. It comes back to the fact that there must be promotion of inclusion of all members of society in this debate. Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Colin Sage for his very thought-provoking speech, the panellists for their views and expertise, and my thanks to you all for your participation, and to my own colleagues who have assisted in my preparations today. A particular word of thanks again to Anya Lawler, who has dealt with this so expertly. Thank you.